Hi, my name's Chad King. I'm covering a blog series today about VMware Home Labs and things of that nature. I wanted to detail real quick kind of the different VMware labs out there today. They're one of two that you're going to end up using. You're either going to be using a nested VMware vSphere lab that's being virtualized on something like VMware Workstation 7 or 8, or you're going to be using like an actual physical VMware vSphere lab. There's pros to cons to each. You can see it here kind of on my blog post where usually the nested lab is a little bit cheaper. It's a little bit easier, simpler. You have a lot more control. You can make changes. You can, quickly provision stuff, deploy things like that. The only thing you really run into on the nested type of setup is that performance. So, to some degree, um, VMware users like to do what's called, a deeper nesting, which is running a virtualized ESX hypervisor, and on that hypervisor running VMware guest. And when you start getting to that level of virtualization, your performance gets, dinged a bit. So there's some things you can do to improve that to make it better. And I'll cover some of that too in another blog post. But there is the other type, which is the physical. Physical is kind of the real world production setup. It's going to be more expensive because you have things that you want to be able to achieve like physical networking, and you want to use management networking usually. You can achieve some level of management networking in a nested lab, but in a physical VMware lab, you want to try to mirror production as much as possible. Of course, then you have storage, some sort of iSCSI device, or you could use like a virtual storage iSCSI, something like OpenFile or MC Solaire, things like that. Nikipedia does a great write-up on some of that stuff. But of course, you have to be able to meet HCL, and then you have build-outs and rebuilds, and the real benefit of a physical VMware vSphere lab is going to be that you can run VMs on it. So whereas in a VMware workstation setup, you kind of have a performance hit on that, and in the actual physical setup, it's running much better, much quicker. Your performance isn't as big as an issue, and it's more real world type of setup. Say that 5 times fast. The only real benefit that the nested really closes the deal for me is the fact that I can easily move stuff. If I have a VMware workstation, I can take VMs on my desktop, move them to my laptop, move them in and out of vSphere as well. So it's not always, it's a little bit more flexibility with what you can do. The physical, you'd have to import, export VMs and stuff like that, which is a little bit more time consuming. And I don't know, I don't like the idea of, having to take, having to take like physical servers and stuff with me where I go if I was to do a presentation or something like that. It's just really convenient to have that whole nested lab set up. I mean, to have the win-win, I mean, you could always do both, if you really have the money for that. The physical is a little bit more expensive. The nested's a little bit cheaper. A nested setup, I'm going to tell you, you want to have about, I would recommend over 16 gigs of memory to be able to really do an official lab setup. You could do it with more than 8. I run 8 and I manage with 8 perfectly fine, but I'm finding that I'm going to have to quickly upgrade. So right now I'm kind of looking at upgrades and what I want to do first for my own lab here at home. But in a nutshell, that's pretty much the two types of labs. You have the nested VMware workstation lab, and then you have the physical VMware workstation lab. And then you want to consider things like storage and networking and design and what your lab and what you want your lab to achieve. So that's another main key point is in VMware Workstation Lab you can quickly provision and decommission stuff. So you can set you up a lab to test and do something, and you can turn them all off, and then you can go and you can deploy something else or some other features. It's going to be a little bit of a challenge to run a lot of these features together. I've seen some people do like different VMware Workstation setups on 2 different boxes, and then they have just 2 different labs running that way too. So I mean, it's it's however you want to do it really. The other thing you want to think about is networking and how you want to set that up. I mean, personally, a lab for me is that I want it to reflect production as much as possible. If you're looking for a quick fix or something like that, I mean, just you can Google lab setups and find something that is, installing vCenter, installing ESXi, and installing shared storage, and you can be up and running within an hour or less, sometimes even maybe 30 minutes if you already have part of that done. I just want to identify certain gaps in certain labs and cover those each individually. It's just kind of like having an Active Directory. I think that's really, really important. Actually using and setting up DNS and having FQN and just having an actual true infrastructure setup lab, because that's going to how you're going to learn and grow the most from your actual when you go take your VCP5 or when you're actually testing products. It's like, if you don't have AD and some of these other core functionalities, then you can't test like all the automation and stuff you want to do. So it's important to kind of have all these components of an infrastructure in your lab, so that way when you're doing tests and doing stuff, you know what the expected outcome would be to a degree. Obviously, the networking is important too. I like to have a separate management network, so I like to have my hypervisors management on a separate subnet. In VMware Workstation, I just route it over a different VM net, 8, 7, whatnot, and then of course I have a double interface on my vCenter server that talks back to the management network, but can also talk out on the production network. And the production network is going to be the network that your VMs are, communicate off of and things like that. I've seen some scenarios in some environments where they like to have two interfaces on virtual machines, or they like to have a management interface to be able to manage the VMs through private VLANs, and I've seen where they have that other interface being on production. Basically, the production network is a lot more hardened because on the management side, they allow infrastructure services to access the VMs through that interface. Things like antivirus, backup software, other things like Active Directory as well. I've seen all kinds of different variations of it, and they'll just use PVLANs to manage all that. And then, of course, it's an unroutable network, a PVLAN is, and so you have to use like NAT pinning through a firewall and things like that to get to it. But it's essentially, the idea is that you have a lower management cost, because if you know what's on the PVLAN and you allow this to talk to this and this to talk to that, you don't have any firewall management and stuff like that going on either. So that's kind of the benefits of having like a management network and a production network and separating that traffic. But mostly this is just a recommendation from VMware to do it. And I say, hey, if it says it in the book, you can't go wrong, right? So as long as you're doing that, you can always point it back at them. But that's what I want to do. I want to try to replicate production as much as possible in my lab, so that way I can get the same expected or desired results. And you'll be seeing that as I go through having the different interfaces and stuff like that. Another thing is, of course, storage considerations, how you want to do your storage in your lab. You can do anything from buying an iSCSI appliance like, the, what do they call it, the NX or iOmegas, whatnot, iSCSI appliances. They have some Cloud Edition certified appliances. You got virtual storage appliances, which take your local storage and virtualize it so that way your hypervisors can access it. And that's like things like OpenFiler, as well as simulators like NetApp and EMC offers, like EMC Solera. And then you have HP Left Hand. I think there's one called Magic Store. Then you have Falcon Store. And then you have Data Core, I think. I mean, there's so many virtual storage appliances. And then you have the new VMware storage appliance as well. And the requirements of that are a little bit more stringent. And hopefully I'll be able to show and demonstrate and test that as well. But I just kind of want to cover the differences of the labs and kind of what you need to think about when you're doing a lab and how you're going to set it up. Again, I'll be covering everything from Active Directory all the way through just a basic vSphere cluster setup, and then we'll go through systematically, look at each feature. And I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. Like if someone does a really wonderful blog post, I'm not going to go and just redo their entire blog and then post it on my blog. I mean, I'm going to link to other sources and just make sure there's no gaps. And if there's not a video, I may go and do a video on it just to kind of show people what it is, so that way you have the media there in a documentation form, and then you have it there in a video form. And of course, I mean, I'm all about giving props to the people who actually do those things. So anyways, thanks for joining me, and I hope that you learned a lot from this, and I'm looking forward to sharing my series with you. Thanks.